So turn to 2 Corinthians 5:21. This is one of my favorite texts in all of Scripture, and I always come to this text with joy. You know, there are some verses of Scripture that stand out above others for their amazing clarity, for the potency of the truth that they contain, or for the simplicity with which they speak. This morning's text is one of those verses that stands out as particularly significant. 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says this, "For he hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him." The whole gospel message is contained in those few words. This text explains the nature of the atonement, the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and the principle of substitution. It teaches us about the character of God, the sinlessness of Christ, the simplicity of salvation. It summarizes biblical soteriology, or the doctrine of salvation. It has important implications for Christology, too, or the doctrines of the person and work of Christ. And it teaches us something about theology proper, because it plainly assumes the sovereignty of God, the love of God, the justice of God, and the grace of God. So there's all of systematic theology bound up in this very short verse. And I hope you understand what I mean when I say this is one of the most important and far-reaching texts of Scripture. It's also one of those crystal clear verses that helps us to make better sense of the rest of Scripture and some of the difficult parts of Scripture. This text and other clear texts like this help explain the significance of the priestly and sacrificial laws of the Old Testament. This text also illuminates the meaning of the cross of Christ. It reveals why Christ is the only way of salvation from sin. It shows why no good works performed by sinners could ever contribute an iota to their salvation. And it demonstrates how salvation was accomplished for us without any of our own works, and yet in a way that completely fulfilled God's law, upheld God's justice, and vindicated God's own righteousness. This verse, in many ways, is the key that unlocks the meaning of the gospel. In other words, to borrow an expression from Romans 3:26, here is how God can be both just and the justifier of those who believe on Jesus. The text explains how God can pardon sinners and treat them as righteous without in any sense compromising his own impeccable righteousness or lowering his perfect standard in any way. I love my pastor's summary of the meaning of this text. John MacArthur often goes to this text, and his summary of it sort of bears repeating. It's also a pretty good paraphrase of the text itself. Here's what this verse is saying in the words of my pastor, John MacArthur. This means that on the cross, God treated Christ as if he had committed all the sins of every sinner who would ever believe, so that he could treat believers as if they had lived the perfect life of Christ. Look at the verse again. "He hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him." This is all about the atoning work of Christ. Its meaning can be summed up in a simple principle, substitution. And it describes an exchange that took place through the atonement that Christ offered our sin for his righteousness. That's the exchange. He took the place of sinners so that they might stand in his place as a perfectly righteous man. And notice the graphic language. He was made sin. That's the very epitome of all that is despicable and odious. He was made sin so that we might be made righteousness. That's everything that is good and pure and acceptable in God's estimation. And so this was the exchange. Our sin for his righteousness. Our sin charged to his account, his righteousness credited to our account. And that's a profound concept. It is the heart of the gospel, and several amazing things about it stand out on the face of this text. First of all, notice, God did this. He, that's God, hath made him, that's Christ, to be sin for us. It was God who appointed his own Son to stand in the place of sinners. And in the words of Acts 2:23, Christ was delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. God did this. Christ's death on the cross was not something merely inflicted on him by the wicked hands of sinful men. It was that, but it wasn't only that. This was not merely an atrocity that was instigated and carried out in the strength of human free will. God ordained it. As Isaiah 53 verse 10 says, "It pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. He made his soul an offering for sin." God did this. And Acts 4:28 says that what happened at the cross was precisely what the hand and the counsel of God predetermined to be done. God was the one who offered this amazing sacrifice on behalf of sinners. And it was all done, according to John 19:28, that the Scripture might be fulfilled. The cross was not an accident of history or an afterthought, but long before the beginning of time, this was the predetermined plan of a sovereign God to redeem sinners. That's why Revelation 13:8 refers to Jesus as the Lamb slain from the foundation of the earth. And so, as I said, the truth of God's sovereignty permeates this text. God did this.